I look forward just to talking about some of my career, but really talking about the arc of the evolution of the renewable energy industry, which really coincided with my career right after I left Cornell in 1974. So I'm talking about the new dominance of renewable energy in energy markets, especially in electricity markets. Now, I talk about the arc or the evolution of how renewables got to where it is today, but it had a number of sort of root causes, or there were a number of problems which arose over the last several decades, which had as a common denominator, in terms of a solution, was renewable energy. Not only renewables, but these are sort of drivers that sort of had a lot of people saying, well, we should be doing more in renewables. So one area was in, say, the need for energy security. And my talk today is largely focused on the US, but much of it applies globally as well. But I think just to keep things more focused, my focus will be on the US. So need for energy security, also just protection of human and environmental health, a lot of that coming about from, say, pollution of all various formats, but primarily air pollution. Climate change and efforts to mitigate it. Also the need to innovate away from the traditional monopoly utility model. We'll talk more about that. And then lastly, addressing demand, both from the general public, but also from corporate America as well, because they are a key stakeholder who are helping to drive the renewable energy movement. Now, to have some context with all this, I just wanted to show sort of the evolution of primary energy sources for the United States over the last 240 years. And, where it really started off with wood, of course, and then, coal really became dominant, then petroleum, then natural gas, and then nuclear came on sort of later, and only, maybe the last 50 years, and then renewables as well. And I'm really going to be focusing on that little green slice at the very, very top, renewables. And my time frame focus is going to be on since the 1970s, which is really a pivotal decade, as far as I'm concerned, that really launched public's awareness, government awareness in the need to shift away from those drivers that I just talked about. And that's helped really enforce renewables. And so that little slice is, I'm calling it the new dominance, but that new slice is quite influential, as I'll show in a moment. Also, I want to show context, too, that this big graph talks about overall energy sources, but I'm going to be focusing primarily on electrical sources of energy. And so electricity comprises about 40% of the overall breakdown of energy supply. That's followed by the transportation sector, industrial. As you can see, commercial, residential are really small pieces. But I'm primarily focusing on electrical. And then we will be talking a little bit more about electric vehicles and sort of the plans to have an increasing piece of the transportation sector become electrified and to move away from fossil fuels and to have more and more transportation fuels be derived from renewables. And that's where batteries will have to come into the equation. So that's something that's beginning to emerge now, and also is helping to drive renewables. Of course, we can't talk about renewables and sort of problems in general without talking about greenhouse gas emissions, because these are some of the things that society wants to reduce. And if you look at the far left, the electricity sector is the largest sector that contributes to greenhouse gases, primarily from coal, followed closely behind by transportation, and then lesser sources as well. The graph on the right just shows how in the US emissions have trended over the last 12, 13 years. And the upper graph is the electric power one, which is showing a decline in emissions, whereas the other sectors are more or less flat. So we're making some improvements, not dramatic ones, but you can see in the electricity sector, we are making gains. And that's largely due to the fairly rapid reduction in our dependence on coal over the last 10 years. Of course, down below, these are graphs of, say, CO2 concentrations within the atmosphere, sort of the classical curve showing how it's been increasing since the 1950s. And what's interesting is that the rate of change is increasing. So the curve is steepening really when we want it to relax, when we want that rate of increase to slow down. But so far, it's not slowing down. So you can see at the bottom right, sort of the rate of increase, it's just accelerating. So that's obviously cause for concern. Maybe one more slide in terms of background and context. Since I'm focusing on electricity sources, just want to focus in on, okay, what are the primary sources of electricity? And this is going back to the 1950s. And again, coal has been and continues to be a dominant, not a majority. It was a majority not too many years ago, but now it's maybe about a third of electricity supplies is sourced from coal. Natural gas has come in, and there's been a lot of development since the 1990s. Nuclear is relatively flat, and renewables, which include hydro, they're relatively small at the top there, but expanding gradually. Petroleum is used very little for electricity production. On the right-hand side, just showing, and the color schemes are somewhat different here, so like brown is natural gas on the right side, but it's just showing that additions of new capacity of electrical generation, new power plants being built since 2002. Say beginning around 2002 or so, there was a lot of new natural gas plants being built. And then you can see the green, wind getting a good chunk. Wind energy on a commercial large-scale basis got going much earlier than solar. Solar has been more of a phenomenon of the last 5 to 8 years. Even though the technology has been around a long time, it hasn't been commercially viable in terms of price until very recently. But wind, much more so, even beginning last decade or two of the last century. But wind has really taken off in the last, say, 15 years. And in some cases was making up the majority of new electrical capacity in the United States that was beating out gas and every other conventional power source. And then you can see in, say, 2013 to 2016, the yellow slice is solar. That's coming onto the scene now. And natural gas, which is the brown, has sort of slowed down. But on the bottom side, the bars going downward are retirements of plants. So we've got plants being built, but we also have plants which are being taken offline. And certainly in the last, say, 5, 6 years, the black there is coal. And so there's an acceleration in the retirement of coal plants, not only in North America, not only in the US, but also in Canada. For example, the province of Ontario, our neighbors to the north, about 25% of their electricity back in, say, 2003 was from coal. Today, it's 0. Their last kilowatt hour from coal plant was delivered in 2014. So they made a decision to shut down coal as an electricity source in the early 2000s, and they got the job done in 10 years. And that was 25% of their electricity sources. So amazing. Some of that they converted to natural gas. They recommissioned nuclear power plant and developed a lot more wind and solar, but just telling you the dynamics that are changing quite a bit. So as you can see, basically what's happening is that renewables now have become the new dominant source of new electricity production in the US, and that will continue for the foreseeable future. So it's the new source of electricity, not only in the US, but many other economies as well around the world. Now, some of the macro issues, which again go back to when I was going to school here, a lot of it was like air pollution meteorology. Air pollution is terrible. We've got to do something about it. It has a lot of meteorological involvement in terms of atmospheric chemistry and how pollutants are transported globally. But this is one of the issues that the US and other societies have been wrestling with for many decades. And it's something that renewables can address. Inadvertent weather modification, that was something else too. The concept of supersonic transports like the Concorde, and discovery that, hey, there's impacts on the stratospheric ozone. And that was a concern, the impacts of lots of contrails, and just could that be a global cooling phenomenon? So there was more of a sensitivity that we're doing things that could impact our climate. And that really was a realization that came about in the 70s. Oil spills, the Exxon Valdez, 1989, the Deepwater Horizon, in just 7-8 years ago, put a different color on reliance on oil and the things that can go wrong with oil. Nuclear accident, 3 Mile Island in '79, Chernobyl the following decade, and Fukushima in Japan following an earthquake and tsunami earlier this decade. All these events put a different perspective on, do we want to go forward with nuclear? Our reliance on foreign oil, the Arab oil embargo of the 1970s, and just geopolitics and reliance on fuel sources from that part of the world, and just the unrest that continues today. And also the concept of peak oil, where the fear that we've maxed out our production of oil and that oil supplies are depleting, and what are we going to do? The sky's falling if we're going to have fewer petroleum sources while population's increasing. And then most recently, the realization that climate change is real, it's having impacts in a variety of ways. So all these factors are sort of in the soup of renewable energy awareness, and fundamentally a driver that a lot of things have come together where it's really helped renewables in a very indirect, complex course. But you can see a lot of conventional fuels have fallen out of favor, and they really have a lot of negative consequences that I think most of society, decision makers, government realize that we've got to do something about this. So I call the 70s a pivotal decade because a number of things happened which really ensured that there was this public awareness happening, but also some government actions taking place. Now renewables really got a jump start. This was the decade where an EPA was formed to try to have an agency that consolidated all the disparate air quality related regulations that had come about. 1973 was the famous OPEC oil embargo, where our supplies were restricted. The price of fuel tripled. There were long gas lines, and there was this fear that we wouldn't have sufficient oil, and it was being controlled by others. So that was truly a crisis for the United States. It did trigger approval of the Trans-Alaska pipeline very late that year. That really accelerated its acceptance. Then in '75, the first CAFE standards. This is a sort of corporate automobile fuel economy. So really mileage guidelines for vehicles were first established. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was created, and the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority was created as well. New York has been one of the top 2 states in terms of helping to drive at a state level energy policy, with California being the other. So being New York based and being Albany based for much of my career, that really helped me stay engaged and make a difference for New York State in the renewable spectrum, but also making that grow internationally as well. Jimmy Carter, when he became president, an engineer, a nuclear engineer, he did some graduate school at Union College in Schenectady, but he really spoke a lot about energy efficiency, alternative energy sources. He had a famous speech that said that energy efficiency and approaching energy independence was the moral equivalent of war. He was really serious. It was a doomsday kind of a scenario. It was sort of depressing, but it got everyone's attention. So lots of other things sort of got triggered as well, including a very severe winter around that time too. So Time magazine has a famous cover wondering about the coming of the next ice age. Like maybe we're approaching the next ice age. It was just, here we are in global warming, right? And ice age was all the rage then. So a number of other things happening as well, closing out the decade with that 3 Mile Island nuclear accident and the Iranian hostage crisis, which really helped maybe ensure that Jimmy Carter wasn't reelected, and then it went on to Ronald Reagan. So, to summarize, the decades could be called, first, pre-1970s, maybe the golden age, when it was really conventional fuels, very centralized, large utilities and power plants, and then the Arab oil embargo, air pollution issues really becoming more serious, a need to change the paradigm for energy. Eventually went to deregulation of utilities, which allowed for the private sector or independent power producers to also build plants and sell into the utility grid, and to start creating a market for the private sector. And then renewables really started to take off as well, especially in this current century, and they've really taken off dramatically. So if we talk about a few more policies, and then I'll get into some other practical aspects of renewables development. But I just wanted to point out just some other hallmark pieces of legislation which we take for granted today, but it's important to put them also into context, because context is really important to talk about maybe where we're going and why we are where we are today. But in 1992, there was an Energy Policy Act that really got electric deregulation going, which really means that utilities, not nationally, but many utilities in many states, were required to sort of unbundle some of their services, and in many cases had to stop delivering some of the services they were already doing. So for example, say utilities in New York State had to get out of the generation business. You can't own the power plants anymore. You can't run them. You can run the transmission lines, own and operate the transmission lines, and sell energy, but you can no longer be the generating company as well. So lots of states took that approach as well. So that, which meant the private sector had to come and do that. But that was a key issue. This was associated with open access, making the utility not monolithic and centrally controlled, but beginnings of making it more democratic. The production tax credit, which came out of that same act, has been instrumental for the wind energy industry, primarily large-scale wind farms. And wind energy has been, the most successful component of renewable energy thus far. Solar energy, particularly photovoltaics, have sort of caught up in some regards in terms of the amount of new capacity being built. We'll get into that in a moment. But this production tax credit really was an incentive to wind farm operators, and it was production that was being incentivized, not construction, as it used to be in the, let's say, in the 80s in California. But you only got a tax credit for every kilowatt hour produced, so you had to produce it. And if you didn't produce power, you didn't get the incentive. So it really incentivized good projects built in good locations that were highly productive and would operate for long periods of time. So it incentivized quality and endurance. States, the Renewable Portfolio Standard, that's still existent for about 29 states today. It's widespread. States really have been the driver for renewable energy, not the federal government. There hasn't been an energy policy in this country for decades. And there still isn't one. But states have come up with quantitative targets that said we shall derive a certain percentage of our electricity sources from renewable resources by a certain year. So very, targets, but also achievable targets. And so policy and other incentive programs had to then follow that. In order to fulfill these targets, other things had to follow to make sure it happens. And so these still exist today. Many states start off with maybe a 15 or 20 or 25% target by a certain time frame, like 2020. They've been updating. New York State is now up to 50%. Some states are thinking about going to 100%. And so it's based on success with the, maybe the first 10 to 15 years of their programs. And then also, I won't go through every single line here. Other incentives like the 30% investment tax credit for solar, that's really a tax credit on what you install. It's not a production-based, but solar has got a different incentive mechanism that applies both to residential as well as large scale. Wind is primarily a large scale, centralized kind of technology. Solar is all sorts. And lastly, There were some other drivers. One was the Clean Power Plan. That was an executive order that Obama had initiated that was going to be administered by EPA, whereby the US on a state-by-state level needed to reduce its emissions. But each state could come up with its own approach in terms of how to meet their goals. Some states already had aggressive goals and they were well on their way, and other states weren't. But that was reversed by President Trump in 2017. So a number of states are, I know, still knocking on the White House's door saying, hey, please reconsider. But also many states are saying, hey, we're going to do this anyway. So there's much of that going on. What's also been very interesting is that, you know, the adoption of renewable energy and its reality. Like, is it for real, or is it just this fringe technology? You know, there was that skepticism for decades, and certainly in the public mindset and in the political mindset. And the media had a big role in that. It was very frustrating. And because on the one hand, you know, they could be taking a political journalism point of view where they could say, well, yeah, wind energy works, but we have to give the same amount of attention and print to what may be wrong with wind energy. And the same thing with solar and so on. Like, oh, wind turbines kill birds. As opposed to maybe, and this also applies to the global warming message, where there was a lot of credit given to the naysayers of global warming, as opposed to the scientific journalism where you should really be driving what the facts are saying. And if there's an overwhelming evidence for global warming, then don't give equal time to both sides, because you're confusing the public, you're confusing the legislators. And it really was around 2007 when I saw a sea change, and I think it came about at the same time that Al Gore, Vice President, came out with the documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, and his book. Then it really seemed that the press I just saw changed their behavior right away. So the press was, I think to some degree, mischievous and just trying to keep controversy going with not only renewables but also global warming. But then once that changed, and other reports like these consistent reports from the climate change panel, then the press was acting differently. So I guess what I learned there is you really have to educate the press. You also have to go out and educate decision makers. So, you know, as part of being in the wind energy industry and the solar energy industry is, you know, getting involved in some industry associations where you may have a lobbying day on Capitol Hill. And so you go meet with your legislators, or you do that in their home districts, and just talk to them about renewables. And, you know, if you get an audience, typically these folks, you know, they have, you know, 5 seconds to learn about any issue because they're being hit from all sides on every issue. But if they have someone there who really is trying to act objective and just trying to talk about it with them and answer their questions, they go, oh, I didn't realize it. They really want to learn. And so investing time with them, they really, by and large, they want to do something that's right. So you just have to invest time in getting their attention. If you can't get the legislators, you get to their staff people, but you have to invest that time. So let's talk more about you know, the public access to the grid and it becoming more of a private sector-driven economy. This is a totally new paradigm, and it's one that, you know, it's the paradigm of today by and large. And you know, for any new project to be built, it requires an energy company, I'll say that a developer, who has to establish agreements with a whole range of stakeholders, beginning with, say, a landowner, because let's say a wind farm, they're spread out over hundreds or thousands of acres, so you may be dealing with scores of landowners or hundreds of landowners for a singular project. So you have to go and sit in the kitchen, literally, of every landowner and talk to them about what you want to do, and this is the lease fee or the royalty fee you'd be getting if you'd allow me, the developer, to maybe put 1 or 2 turbines on your property. That's going to be there for 20 to 30 years, and that won't make your life miserable and, you know, trust me kind of a thing. That's what the private sector has to go out and do. They have to do that, and they have to get the landowners to say, okay, and then you sign agreements and so on. You have to then also go out to the permitting entities, the local zoning boards, the rest of the public, and certainly with regard to wind systems, which are very large and highly visible, and that's been one of the biggest controversies for wind, has been its visual impact. You also have to sell the power to someone, so you need to interconnect the plant's output to the grid. So you need to have formal approval for that. There's technical studies that need to be done. You need to have someone buy that power. It may be the utility that owns and operates the grid, or it may not be. It may be some other entity that's going to buy the power at a distant location, and the energy is wheeled through a paper transaction to that other entity. Most of the money that's used to build projects is borrowed from banks. So if it costs $300 million to build a particular project, you have to go out and maybe get $200 million from a bank. So there's all that you have to deal with. You have to go out and get the equipment suppliers and people to build and operate your project for you if you're not doing it yourself. So there's a whole slug of contractual agreements, engagement with a whole range of stakeholders before a project can become a reality. Typically that will take, say, 3 to 5 years anyway. This includes all sorts of technical studies, like for measuring wind resources or solar resources, doing environmental studies to understand what the potential bird impacts may be, noise impacts would be, shadow flicker, in terms of impacts of flicker of the sun, the blades rotating through the sun, and it may impact someone's house for 15 minutes each day on a sunny day, and so on. And you don't get to yes until you've invested all this time and dollars. And if someone somewhere says no, you've lost all your funds, period. You don't have any backup. Like the utility, if they go out and try something and it didn't work, the stakeholders, the ratepayers or the stockholders of the utility company would pay. But here in the private sector, you have all the risk. And no one is saying we're going to buy the power either. So that's been a dilemma in this new energy sector, is that there aren't safety nets. But the industry has moved forward and is doing quite well with that. It's quite sophisticated. So I've mentioned some of the challenges that have been overcome. And so the renewable industry has been remarkably an overcoming industry. They've met all these challenges with excellence and endurance and persistence. Many times projects don't happen because they run into roadblocks. That's the way it is. But also just the state of the science has really been advanced in terms of understanding really bird behavior and bird populations and migration corridors and, for example, or bats as well. It's an amazing amount of dollars which have gone into really understanding birds and the significance of takes or kills, because wind turbines kill birds. But as you can see in the upper right there, if you look at everything that kills birds, that there's an overwhelming amount of bird kills just from other sources, not just, let's say maybe roughly half the birds that are born die to begin with. Just like sea turtles when they're trying to reach the water from across the beach and they're picked off by seagulls and so on, small fraction make it. So that's nature. But also things like cats and vehicles and windows and pesticides and so on kill orders and orders and orders of magnitude more birds than wind turbines. But the dialogue was, wind turbines kill birds, we should not have wind turbines, without context. There's also the other question, what about all our conventional fuels and all the, say, the pollution, mercury poisoning, and just air pollution, the destruction of habitat, in terms of other things we're doing in land use development and so on. Those are having impacts on birds too. Are we looking at that just as seriously as we're being required to ask, say, for wind, sort of the new technology on the block? The answer was no. So there's a lot of unfairness there. So that's why incentives were very important to help level the playing field. You know, that expression that's been used an awful lot. It's trying to deal with the positive attributes that wind brings, such as even emitting no pollution. And in terms of the cost of energy, you know, any dirty fuels, you know, the indirect costs to health and other impacts that ultimately have financial implications aren't captured in the cost of energy sources from conventional fuels, but they are inherently captured in the price of clean energy. So that was uneven. That's just the nature of the beast. So other things happen along the way as well, but as you can see, there's a lot of other types of studies that need to be done. Some of them technical, some of them are environmental, some of them are emotional when it comes to activism or anti-wind activism, where there's a lot of misinformation being sent out there intentionally, and just to stop a project and not being fact-based. One thing I wanted to show here in the bottom right is that one of the things which is said about renewables is that they are intermittent. I prefer the word variable because intermittent can mean on and off, but really they're variable in their output. But I'm a meteorologist by background, and wind and solar resources are highly predictable. They're not unpredictable, they're highly predictable. And what's shown here in the bottom right is our forecasts of all the wind in Texas, because my company forecasts all the wind projects for utilities and transmission system operators in New York, in Texas, in California, and other places as well. And so just looking at actual versus predicted production, we could do an excellent job. So actually, the state-of-the-art of forecasts today provides 85% of the value to utilities that perfect forecasts would be. These are forecasts that are predicting what the output of a wind project would be at 7 o'clock tonight, 7 o'clock tomorrow night, but doing it in 15-minute increments through today, through tomorrow, because scheduling of generation facilities is required throughout the entire utility industry. If it's a coal plant, nuclear plant, it's also a solar project, and it's also a wind project. So everyone has to play into this scheduling field, and so you have to predict. And so the state-of-the-art is really advanced. So it's quite predictable. So wind is sort of the dominant renewable energy resource in the United States today, about 90,000 megawatts. A typical nuclear power plant or a coal plant might be 500 megawatts to 1,000 megawatts, but there's 90,000 megawatts of wind plants. On land, only one small project offshore off of Block Island, Rhode Island, but there'll be a lot more offshore wind energy developed over the next 10 to 20 years in the US. There are probably 70 some odd offshore wind projects, primarily in Northern Europe, and also an increasing number off of China and Korea. So that's growing quite strongly. A nice dimension about wind power has been that it really has provided a second crop to agriculture. It's really kept a lot of the farming community farming because it often works on the economic edge. But by having a second crop, having wind turbines that are paying royalties, pretty healthy royalties, but occupying just a small fraction of the land, let's say 5%. And you can always site turbines at the edge of fields. So that enables the cropland to continue being cultivated and for the landowners to do what they're doing and want to keep doing, but with this extra revenue without them having to put any efforts into it at all. Also, projects will pay to the community, payments in lieu of taxes to help improve schools, get new school buses, whatever the case may be. What's interesting is that if you look at the political spectrum, because wind projects are built in rural areas, by and large, they're built in Republican districts across the United States. And at least 85% of wind power are in Republican districts. So, it's Republicans support wind. You wouldn't think so sometimes. Sometimes they just have to act as though they don't, but they really do. So it really is a bipartisan topic, renewables is. So that's just something that it's tough to overcome sometimes when talking in the political spectrum. But it's really embraced that way too. Also, about 70% of wind capacity is built in low-income counties. So that really just helps provide extra sources of revenue in a very measurable way. And this study done at the University of Michigan just shows the levels of investment that farmers who have wind turbines on their properties versus those who don't. That those who do have wind turbines on their property, they didn't pay a penny to get it there. They just happen to have a windy site, open land area, and a willingness to sign the contract. So they're getting, you know, they may be getting 30 grand a year more per turbine, and that, you know, over 20 years, that's a lot of money. And so they're putting that money into new farm machinery, buying more farmland. So it's making them healthier farmers by allowing wind to coexist. For solar, the US has great resources there too, and it's showing there the top states where a lot of the resources, a lot of new solar capacity is occurring, you know, the blue colors in the upper right. And this is largely driven by policy, where, say, New York is not known for its resources, solar resources, but it's as good, if not better, than in Germany, where there's a lot of solar. And that's where they really, and policies are driving solar very strongly. So New York has been driving it, North Carolina has been driving it. So that isn't just good resources, it's also policy that's just trying to drive it. And of course, solar, I mentioned already that large-scale wind, wind is largely used for large-scale applications. You don't see lots of homes with small wind turbines for a variety of reasons. But there are different business models for solar, residential, commercial, as well as utility scale. Most of the capacity of solar in the United States is utility scale. But most of the projects, you know, there's lots of single, like 1, 2, 3 kilowatt residential. So the individual projects is maybe 95% of the projects are residential and commercial. But the capacity, it's driven by utility scale. So let's talk about attitudes, public attitudes, how they've changed over time. People want more clean energy sources compared to traditional energy sources. So it's a 2-to-1 ratio. Depending on how you ask the question, you may get a response rate that's much higher, you know, like 85%. You're like, yep, I support wind energy in my community. Because that's an important aspect, in my community. Because the not in my backyard issue isn't a very important one, and has been a roadblock for a number of proposed projects. And I get it, of course. You know, people bought a second home. It's usually second homeowners who are the most vocal, whereas people who have family farms, they may support it more because it's helping them get more revenue and stay intact. Anyway, so the point on the left is public attitudes are very strong toward renewables universally. Secondly, corporately, a lot more companies are making decisions to go out and buy their future power 100% from renewable resources. So they're actually going out to wind farms and saying, I will buy all your power for the next 20 years at a prearranged rate. And that's a paper transaction where it's wheeled across the power lines. So, you know, the power goes into the local grid, but the transaction, the recipient will be companies like this. There are associations now, companies like the RE100 or the We Mean Business. These are just companies who have signed up to say, I'm going all renewables within the next, usually it's within the next 5 years. So for most of the power purchase agreements today in the US, they're coming from corporations. And so they are they're a big driver today. Now we can talk a little bit about the electricity model transformation. This really gets to the monopoly point of view of the past. Not everywhere, it's not the distant past, it's sort of the waning past. But this is where all power flows one direction from centralized power plants to customers. And so that's the utility model of old. It still exists in much of the country, but it's opening up. I talked before about open access. You can have, there's net metering, which enables you to have, say, a solar system on your home. And if you're not home at the time that the system is producing lots of power, it can put power back into the grid, and you're compensated for that at the same rate, at the same retail rate that you're buying the electricity from the utility. That's net metering. So the utility will keep track of your bill and will give you a net bill, subtracting out the value of the energy that was sent to them. So this is only mushrooming in a much bigger way. Distributed energy resources is sort of the new term that just talks more about the distribution of not only renewable energy resources, but also demand-side management programs or energy efficiency programs. Also battery storage, that's up and coming capability as well. It's becoming more economical. And also just the term, the digital grid. That more of the grid and more of our homes and appliances being connected to the internet, and just the Internet of Things, with more and more things being connected, that allows more communications and more control or management of energy, both on the generation side and on the demand side. So that may be more like a cloud concept, and so this opens up a lot more opportunities to run the overall energy system, electrical energy system, more efficiently and more dynamically. But it just makes it more complex. So how is it going to be truly managed? Who's going to be the manager? So these are things to work out. But this is where we're rapidly going. And so it's just the new model. Smart grid may go to neural grid, where smart grid is where it's sort of you're going in and opening the door for new systems, new technologies, more distributed systems. But neural grid is when, okay, you've got more or less universal communications and the ability to manage everything because you know what everyone's doing. And you can also have forecasts provided where you understand, well, what's the new load going to be, or how much solar or wind will be really available several hours from now, so that maybe you can ramp up or discharge storage, those sorts of things. Other various growth projections. All projections have renewables just growing strongly into the future. But the Energy Information Administration, has a base case or reference case here shown on the left, and then it has two other future scenarios. One being a low oil and gas resource scenario, and then one is a high oil and gas resource scenario, which I think they even say, it's more doubtful that you're going to be resorting to more oil and more gas. But it's just showing that, let's say under that on the left, under a reference case, the renewables bypasses, say, coal. It bypasses nuclear very soon, let's say within the next couple of years. Bypasses, say, coal, which is going to be around for quite some time here in the US, for maybe by 2030, and then starts approaching natural gas. But the dynamic could change much sooner than that if you go with a low oil and gas future, whereby renewables can, say, maybe within the next 15 years, become the dominant new energy source. So there are various ways to look at future trends, but renewables will continue to be the dominant player in terms of new capacity. And this isn't because they're being driven by incentives anymore. The costs have dropped so low for both wind and solar that they're becoming economical in their own right. For large-scale sales or in auctions for new capacity, prices are down maybe just a few cents per kilowatt hour, which is lower than natural gas, lower than coal, lower than nuclear, which typically are 5 to 10 cents per kilowatt hour. And those costs are just going to continue to decline even further than they are today, even with some of these incentive programs phasing out, like the production tax credit is going to be phasing out, as is the investment tax credit for solar. So they're both ramping down over the next 2 to 5 years, but that's okay. The technology's getting cheaper, they're becoming more efficient. Wind turbines are becoming even bigger in size. That's the economy of scale. Solar systems are becoming more efficient as well. Trackers are being used more on a more widespread basis. So they're just getting better and more efficient. I talked a little bit about storage. It is the next disruptive technology. Storage, say battery storage, has always been around, or been around a really long time, but it hasn't been cost effective to be an effective part of the energy mix in terms of the grid. And certainly it's great for portable devices, but for grid applications it's just too expensive. But prices have been coming down dramatically, particularly in the lithium-ion space, because groups like Tesla and others who have invested a lot in gigafactories and in the state of the science. Other corporations are moving that way too, and they're really driving down the cost of energy. But there are other drivers. I mean, the key drivers here are also electric vehicles, because the new paradigm is going to electric vehicles. Some countries are saying we're not going to allow fossil fuel vehicles after, say, 2040. Some countries have already said that, and there's probably going to be more of that going on. So that means that more of the fuels that are used in the transportation sector that we saw before are going to now moved to the electrical sector. And so fossil fuels that are used for driving vehicles would then be sourced from solar and wind projects and energy stored in batteries. So this is what the future is looking like. So costs for batteries are expected to continue to drop, and maybe another 75% for lithium ion, for example, by the year 2030. And it'll probably get low enough, even in the next 4 years, where batteries can start displacing gas peakers, which are widely used on the grid today to help deal with those short periods of time when you have these excessive electrical peaks, say very hot summer days, where electricity demand spikes. And sometimes you may get brownouts. So gas plants are used to do that. And there's a class of plants that are used only for that. So they may only provide 1% of the energy, electrical energy in the country, but they're sitting there idle, most of the time. So those can be displaced probably by batteries going forward. There's also more talk about, using batteries maybe in conjunction with solar and using them in homes. So getting back to Tesla, they have large-scale battery farms in concept. They have batteries for electric vehicles. And they also have batteries for homes, like the solar wall, or the power wall, they call it. So they have a variety of, the whole full spectrum of battery applications that they see as their vision, and others are moving in that direction as well. China is really driving the battery manufacturing business, and China is the dominant player in the battery manufacturing market, and they will continue to be. So Tesla is the leader here in the States, and there'll be some other leaders as well, but China will continue to be the leader going forward, and they are making mandates about shifting to electric vehicles as well. So they're also going to be driving sort of the electric vehicle industry in many aspects about it. Some other comments to make about, just where batteries may go if they continue to get cheaper and cheaper. They may also give people the opportunity to detach from the grid, called here grid defection. I think that's something that's way out there, and whether or not that's wise or not to do to be independent of the grid 100% of the time, you may not want to do that. But there is the concept of microgrids, which is growing more strongly today, and that's really having storage and your own energy efficiency measures and your own local generation, such as wind, solar, biofuels, and so on. They give you the option to disconnect from the grid, but you can also be connected to the grid at times as well and maybe be a source of power to the grid. So that's where I'm seeing more of that dynamics, where you have more of that autonomy to be separate from the grid, or you can just be intermittently with the grid, depending on market signals. This is a graph just highlighting just where, on the left, where battery packs, say for electric vehicles, are expected to drop so much further, which would really help accelerate the growth of electric vehicles. And again, the reliance of the transportation sector more and more on renewables. And I show here that batteries make up about 1/3 of the cost of electric vehicles. So that's a big chunk of money. So if you can really drive down the cost of batteries, you can make electric vehicles more affordable for you and me. So getting close to the end here, there have been some discussions and talks about, could we go 100% renewables in the US? And there was a paper that was published by some researchers at Stanford, Mark Jacobson and others in energy and environmental science. And so he laid out roadmaps for every single state in terms of how they could shift all their energy usage, not just electricity usage, to renewables. And this chart here just shows a time frame whereby that could be done. And it's a time frame that relies a lot on solar and wind. It's primarily solar and wind, but also water resources or hydro, as well as wave and tidal energy. So it really works with those three sources, wind, water, and sunlight, where they came up with a paradigm where that by 2050 you could be 100% renewable source for all energy. This also implies or applies a lot of energy efficiency, so that our energy demand is actually going down significantly by 39%. And the study also looked at job and health impacts, land use implications. This paper became a fairly controversial paper as well, and over the last several months there's been a lot of scientific discussion and some angry discussion that you can't reach 100%. But to me, it's not if you can be 100%, you can be 80%. There are a lot of people who say you can go 80%. NREL did a study even before the Stanford study that said you could go to 80%. So, I mean, if we're at 10% today from renewables, say wind and solar, we don't have to worry about is it 80, is it 100, I think putting a paper out there that says 100 really gets you thinking. And I think that's really what was intended. And technically, is it technically feasible? Yeah. Is it doable in other practical measures? Well, that's a lot harder. But the point is, renewables can be a much bigger piece of the pie. You know, that was one of the early barriers too. The conventional wisdom was that renewables can only be maybe 5, 10, 20% of the penetration of the electric grid, because it was intermittent, and that you would then have to build all sorts of extra generation if you're going to be putting in more renewables, so that you'd have more backup. And that is patently false. There are countries like Denmark who are over 50% renewables. Germany is over 35% renewables. That's on average throughout a year. There are times of the day or year where some countries are 100% renewables, or more than 100%. So Denmark would have all this power coming from wind, and then it would have to export to Sweden because they had too much wind capacity. So you can run a grid with lots of renewables. They're geographically dispersed, which helps reduce the variability of the resource. You've got forecasting, where you just have foreknowledge of what's coming, so that you can balance the system ahead of time. And there's just also acceptance by utility operators that they trust the technology and the forecasts. That was something that didn't exist 20 years ago. They now trust it now. Utilities were very resistant to having renewables forced on them, because they really they knew their power plants and they knew they had to keep the lights on. That's mission number one, keep the lights on. So adding this new stuff was hard for them to understand, to integrate, but now that they've embraced it more and understand it more, then they're saying, sure, we can manage a lot more. So my closing thoughts, just like with the title, you know, renewables, it's not a question of will they be, they will be the dominant new source of electricity. It's just how fast, and then what other things have to happen to integrate it even quicker, perhaps. And some of the factors that will be accelerating this growth are things that I've talked about already: storage and the pace at which it declines in cost, and then sort of the new algorithms that are needed to manage energy storage systems. And also just smart grid. How quickly will there be more and more devices connected and talking with each other, so that you can tell someone's device, why don't you back off for now and turn back on later? You know, are you going to be okay if you're the owner of that device? So it's that kind of interplay where permissions are required. But on the flip side of the coin here, there's still a large chunk of the globe where they don't have any access to electricity, or limited access. So it's at least a seventh of the population that lacks electricity. So I think in these applications, especially in portions of Asia and certainly Africa, going in with a fresh slate, you can look at distributed energy resources, DER, as the answer, which is what they are doing, as opposed to following the track we followed over the past century. You can just start fresh. That's sort of a nice way to look at a problem. Like, what if I didn't have what I have today? What if I was just going to invent our own energy system of the future today? What would that look like? And that's an important thing to do, and say, well, how do I get from here to there? And who gets hurt, who gets helped as I transition? So, but interestingly, a lot of these countries, and particularly the big players like India and China, who have over 1 billion people apiece, even though they're building lots more coal. They have lots of coal, and even in Southeast Asia, they're building a lot more coal plants. And they're running through, the dirtiest cities in the world as well. They're wrestling with that as well. But they are also putting in lots more renewables as well. They're trying to accelerate electrification and industrialization. So they want to get there quickest, with coal plants, but then as clean as possible, but then lots more renewables at the same time. We'll just see how that evolves, but that's happening. And so they'll continue to be, key emissions polluters, but you can see when their trends they'll be on the declining side of the curve there in terms of greenhouse gas emissions over the next 5 to 10 years. So with that, I wanted to give you that quick survey of sort of the evolution of the renewable energy industry, sort of the interplay that it has had with a whole range of stakeholders, the obstacles that it's overcome, and where it's going. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I think there's time for some Q&A. Hopefully you have some questions. Thank you. There's questions up there.
I've heard the phrase generation, transmission, and distribution associated with utilities generally. Do you associate that with the standard utility model? I may not have my terms quite right.
Yeah, those are the right terms. Those are the three principal components of a utility. There's the generating sources. Transmission is really the long distance, high voltage transmission of power. Maybe across hundreds of miles, perhaps even thousands of miles. And then distribution is really taking power from the high voltage level and just really distributing it to homes and businesses at a lower voltage level. And so all three tend to face different regulatory regimes. And so most of the distributed energy sources, homeowners, so on, are dealing with distributed, putting stuff onto the distribution grid, whereas large-scale wind farms are typically interconnected to the transmission voltage, so that's a different regime. So I don't know if I'm answering a question there, but that's just a distinction of the key components of what a classical utility is. Everyone should be mic'd independently here, right?
I saw in one of your slides you mentioned power purchase agreements, and
Yeah.
I know those are a popular way for purchasing solar, especially for people who are trying to buy it residentially, because it takes away that initial huge investment in a new solar system. So I'm from Florida, and Florida is one of a few states that prohibit the purchase of electricity with these agreements, so people have to pay a full price for a residential system installation. So how would you go about trying to change a policy like that?
Boy. Yeah, you need some leaders. It's hard to go in and change policy. You need some leaders who recognize that change is needed, and they see examples of how it's been done in other states. So, if it's a political reason why they can't do it, because it's not technical, it's not economic, so it's got to be political. So that makes it challenging. Now, power purchase agreements typically are agreements, they're long-term sales agreements, generally not with homeowners, but generally with larger system owners who aren't using the energy themselves, but they're just selling it into a grid. And typically they need, well, at least 10 years of a sales agreement, but maybe 20 years or longer, because bank financing usually lasts 10 to 15 years. So they want to get enough revenue over the lifetime of the project to pay off the debt. And so that's what a power purchase agreement will do. For sales, I'm not as familiar with Florida and how they deal with, say, individual homeowners, because there are issues with interconnection agreements. Are they easy or are they hard? If they're easy, if there's a standard interconnection agreement, which just means that you are an independent power producer connecting to the grid. Before it could only just be the utilities big power plants, but this is the open access issue, that you as the public, can actually connect your power plant, it can be small or large, but small typically, and push power into the grid. So there's some interconnection agreements that are required and a technical study, you know, for every single interconnection. And that is like, why can't you have a standard, simple agreement if it's the same type of installation that's being done hundreds or thousands of times across the state? Why do you have to have every single person sweat bullets? And, you know, so that was the case in the early days, and states have said, enough. You know, you're going to have a standardized agreement, you're going to make this low cost. What's the big deal? So one of the things is you want to make sure you have equipment that shuts off when the grid goes down, power outage or something, that you don't want your system islanding or running and injecting power into the grid and endangering people who are working on the lines. So there's equipment that just does that automatically, fail-safe equipment. So there are ways to deal with that. But states typically have a list of approved equipment, suppliers, including, you know, these disconnect features that address all these issues that a utility and that is dealing with interconnection, any concerns they would have. So states have sort of streamlined these roadblocks, and so the net metering issue, if that's not being, I don't know if that's the issue within Florida, that if they don't want to pay back people for the energy that are putting back into the grid. Again, I see that more as a political issue than one that's based on due cause. So. Now we have a couple questions. There's one here. He was up first, and then she had her hand up. This gentleman here.
You mentioned that grid operators using state-of-the-art technology would be able to capture about 85% of the theoretical advantage of perfect forecasting.
Yeah.
How does that compare to actual practice? How effectively are grid operators using forecasting technology right now?
They're using it on a widespread basis. So say in New York State, there's about 2,000 megawatts of wind in New York State. So that's used in a standard practice. So every project is having forecasts provided for it, and they're used by the grid operators. So it's used on a widespread basis throughout the U.S. And it really just comes as a requirement. If you're a generator connected to the high voltage transmission, you have to schedule. You have to predict your output. It's just the nature of the, you know, to manage the grid and to do so reliably, there has to be a forecast for everyone. One of the things that happened with the wind industry was that, you know, if you provided a wrong forecast, you're penalized. That's called an imbalance penalty. So if, you know, under the traditional practices, if you said your coal plant was going to produce 700 megawatts tomorrow and you produced 600 because there was a problem, you were penalized because the grid operators planned on that. Now they have to scramble and use backup power. So you're penalized. But for renewables, where you can't control the weather, you can predict it and predict it well, but you can't control it with absolute accuracy. There needed to be some grace. So what most utility, all of them actually, have done is that if a forecast from a centralized forecasting firm that the utility selects and approves, if they provide the forecasts, and the utility has vetted that company to ensure that they're using the latest state-of-the-art approaches and that they're continuing to invest in R&D, blah, 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 then they will hold the wind plant harmless if the forecast is imperfect. So that's how renewables have been able to schedule without penalty, and that's by utilities saying, okay, we're going to use independent system, I'm using independent forecasters. And it's been my company who's succeeded in doing that, that has enabled renewables to move forward. But also, it's been a partnership with utility operators who at first just didn't know what to do with a forecast of wind coming in. You know, at first they were averse to any of this renewables coming in. And then it's like, well, you got to use it. And so at first they would just discount it and say, well, I'm just going to assume it's always zero. They couldn't get away with that very long. But they just started developing a trust that, oh, these forecasts aren't so bad. And then over time, we worked with them to integrate the forecasts. And these are forecasts of plant output. It's not forecasts of what the wind speeds are going to be. We had to come up with all that and air temperature and all that. But then we ran those forecasts internally through wind plant operational models and to predict what the output would be. And then every single day we'd get feedback from the wind plant to see, well, how well did our forecast verify? And through statistical techniques, you can minimize the biases or errors that you're observing in your forecasts, which may come about due to certain weather conditions or wind plant conditions. And at the same time, the utility is better appreciating the information you're providing. And we don't really know their decision tree within the utility because they have to keep the lights on, period. So if they don't trust something, how do you get them to trust it? So they may want some more information. And so maybe they want more probabilistic forecasts. Like, tell me your uncertainty around your forecast. Sometimes we're very certain about what the wind conditions are going to be on a day, and some other times we're not. There may be some major storm front going through, but we don't know if it's going to go through at 1 o'clock or 2:30 in the afternoon. And that makes a world of difference to the utility. Is like, when do I need to have, when could the lights go off or something? I have to be ready. So a lot more research has gone into improving the state-of-the-art of forecasts for those critical types of events. And that's what makes them not sleep at night. It's the critical events. And so like, okay, we're going to focus our forecast accuracy on critical events because that has the most value or importance to you as a utility. So I guess my point here is that over 20 years of working with utilities now on forecasting, we've been able to understand really the decisions they need to make, and translating the forecast information so that they could make their decisions easier and better grounded. So it was a very iterative process over time, but now they embrace it. Now solar forecasts are happening. And what's interesting is that it isn't just large-scale solar plants. It's also being able to forecast all the solar on all the thousands and thousands of rooftops, say, across California. What's interesting is that the load shape of utilities is changing where there's a lot of solar. When the electric demand was greatest, say, during the afternoon on a summer day. Now that's not the case in California. It's going down because there's so much solar. It's like negative load. The solar is providing power directly to the home, so it's not a demand on the utility, so the demand on the utility is fundamentally changing. But then when the sun sets, all of a sudden there's a steep curve where the demand is increasing in the evening as the sun's going down, which is steeper than ever. So now the utility has now the situation where lower loads during the afternoon, but a greater peak and a rapid change with requirements of new power. If something goes wrong in the system during that critical couple of hours as the demand is growing, that creates a lot of instability and really runs the greater risk of lack of instability, which they can't live with. They got to keep the lights on. So that's driving sort of new need for storage and better research into how to forecast these short-term ramp events, which are now coming about because there's more renewables. It's just changing the fundamental load profile of utilities. And so again, how do we help them with that? And there are ways to do it. So that's a long answer to that question, but it's really a storyline. It's hard to give a short answer sometimes. Thank you.